I will tell you what I know about distress signals, which is this. They work or they don't, and in the 31 years I spent as a field engineer on survey vessels, I could count on one hand the times a signal I sent was the actual reason I came home. The rest of the times I came home, it was because I fixed something, or because the thing that was going to kill me miscalculated, or because someone else died first and that bought me time to reach the tools I needed. Signals are what you send when you have run out of things to fix. They are the last item in the box, the one you pick up when all the real tools are gone. I knew that. I had always known that. I am telling you this so you understand what I mean when I say I kept knocking anyway. The Veth Basin Shelf sits 40 degrees south of the Survey World Calist IV's equatorial band. And in the dry season, which is the only season, because the planet's axial tilt runs close to zero, and the polar caps are a polite fiction covering solid methane rock that hasn't meaningfully shifted in 400 million years. The shelf bakes under a white sky that has no clouds and no mercy. The clay is rust orange and cracked into plates the size of barn doors, and when you walk across it in a survey suit, you can feel the plates shift under your boot soles the way something living and enormous might shift while breathing. The survey teams called it the breathing floor. I had been on Calist IV 4 times over the years, and I had never liked the shelf, not once. It had a quality I couldn't name, something I had tried to put into words in the debrief after my second rotation, and had given up on and filed away without a label. Not menace, exactly. Not the specific feeling of being watched, which I knew from other survey worlds and could identify. More like the feeling you get standing in a room where a conversation just stopped because you walked in. The silence is not empty. The silence knows you. My name is Sierra Vance. At the time this happened, I was 53 years old, which meant I had been doing this job since I was 22, and I had outlasted a considerable number of people who had started it alongside me. I carried the tools of a field mechanic, calibrated tape, plasma cutter, compression wrench set in 4 sizes, patch kit rated for titanium and polyceramic composite both, 2 tubes of hard sealant and 1 of flex, and I carried the habits of a woman who had been in enough genuinely bad situations to understand that staying calm was not a character virtue, but a survival technology. You stay calm because panic burns oxygen and makes you stupid, and in my experience, stupid is more reliably fatal than whatever the actual problem is. I had watched panic kill people on 3 separate survey worlds, and it had always looked the same. Fast decisions, wasted energy, the particular expression on someone's face in the moment they realized that what they just did had made everything worse. I was not a panicking type. I want to say that plainly, not as a boast but as a relevant fact. The actual problem that day was this. Our survey crawler had taken a methane pocket blowout through the port drive housing at approximately 1100 hours local time, 63 kilometers from the nearest secondary equipment cache, and 140 kilometers from the base station. The methane pocket network under the Veth Basin Shelf was mapped in broad strokes but not in fine detail, which was one of the purposes of our survey rotation, to refine the mapping. The blowout point was a fine detail that had not been mapped. It expressed itself as a pressure event that cracked the hull plate along the port ventral seam, which ran from the drive housing bulkhead to the forward landing strut mount, a seam length of approximately 1.2 meters. The crack vented the primary communications array, which ran interior to that seam. The emergency beacon ran on a separate circuit board but shared a power coupling that passed through the same bulkhead, and the thermal flash of the blowout had fused that coupling into what looked, when I found it under the port housing panel, like a 4-centimeter lump of slag. Someone had done reasonable work with the original power routing, but they had not accounted for a direct methane thermal flash at that specific junction, and I could not fault them for it, because it was a genuinely low-probability failure mode, and the person who designed that routing had probably never seen a full methane pocket blowout at close range. I had twice, which was why The moment the crawler stopped and the system alert started cycling, I was already under the port housing panel with my lamp on before the alert had finished its third tone. Our pilot, Derek Osei, had been standing next to the port housing when it blew. He had been doing a ground contact inspection of the starboard strut mounting, which was routine procedure on clay substrates where the plate shift could stress the strut anchoring, and had moved toward the port side 30 seconds before the blowout to compare readings. 30 seconds was not enough time to matter. He was not, after that, in a condition to walk or to pilot the crawler or to make decisions of any kind. He was conscious when Rowan Stiles reached him and not conscious 3 minutes later, and the nature of the injury was the kind that a field kit cannot fix, and that even a well-equipped medical bay addresses with surgery rather than bandaging. Rowan Stiles was our xenobiologist. She had 7 field seasons to her name, which was not nothing, and she had emergency trauma certification, which she had kept current and which was now relevant. She got Derek inside the crawler's cargo hold, and she packed the wound with what we had, and she was doing that when I finished my assessment of the port housing and crawled out from under the crawler to tell her what I had found. She came to the hatch before I could get to her. She had blood on her gloves and on the front of her survey jacket, and her expression was the controlled one, the one that was calm on the surface because the work required calm and underneath was doing things at a different speed. "He needs a medevac," she said. "Not a field kit and not a prayer. A surgical bay, fluids, and time he is running out of." "How long to repair the comms?" I looked at her for a moment. I had run the math already, under the port housing, because that is what engineers do. They run the math before they are asked to, so that when they are asked they do not have to make the other person wait. The emergency beacon circuit is fused. Not damaged, fused, solid. I cannot repair a fused circuit in the field with the kit I have. The primary comms array lost power when the seam cracked and the interior conduit vented. Restoring that requires either the replacement conduit that is in the secondary cache 63 kilometers northwest or something that conducts at sufficient capacity, which is not in my kit. Stiles was quiet. Behind her, through the cargo hold hatch, I could hear the slow, unsteady sound of Derek's breathing. "So our options," she said. "Our options are, walk 63 kilometers to the cache, which is approximately 14 hours on this terrain and which I cannot do faster than that, and which leaves you here alone with Derek. Or wait for the base station check-in protocol to flag us as overdue, which happens at 1800 hours and will trigger a search response that will take 4 to 6 hours to reach us after that. Or I do something with what I have." "What do you have?" I turned and looked at the hull plate. The crack ran along the port ventral seam from the drive housing bulkhead down toward the forward strut mount, but the rear section of the plate, the 1.5 meters nearest the housing bulkhead, was still anchored along both edges, unbowed, structurally intact. It was calloused survey-grade titanium composite, which was the standard material for survey crawlers operating on worlds with elevated methane substrate risk, and it was dense, 4mm gauge, laminated, with good resonance characteristics. I had noticed its ring quality when I was under the housing panel. When I had tapped it with my knuckle while assessing the crack propagation, the sound had traveled clearly, a deep carrying note, the kind that moves through ground contact and through air simultaneously, the kind that in the right geological conditions might carry a meaningful distance through substrate. "Contact percussion," I said. "I tap a distress code on the hull plate through the crawler's ground contact. Anything with a ground-coupled seismic sensor in range picks it up." "There is nothing with a seismic sensor in range. Our team is 63 kilometers out." "I know. Survey-grade contact percussion on clay substrate doesn't carry 63 kilometers. You know that too." "Yes," I said, "I do." Stiles looked at me for several seconds. The controlled expression worked to stay controlled and was working a little harder than usual. "So, who are you sending it to?" I had been thinking about that since I came out from under the crawler. I had been thinking about the quality of the shelf, the conversation that stopped when you walked in, the breathing that was not seismic, the thing the survey files had not given a name to, not formally, not in the sections that covered operational risk and environmental hazard and expected wildlife contact. There was a note in the supplemental geological section, in the part that the pilots and xenobiologists read, but that mechanics generally skipped, about anomalous mass displacement readings that did not correspond to any mapped pocket or fault structure. I had read it on my second rotation because a geophysicist I respected had told me it was interesting. She had not said interesting as in alarming. She had said interesting in the way geophysicists say it when they mean, there is something here that we do not have a category for yet, and we are collecting more data before we say anything about it out loud. I did not know what was under the shelf. I knew the shelf had a quality. I knew that contact percussion through titanium composite would carry into the clay substrate and disperse through the plate network in a pattern I could not predict, because I did not have a map of the plate network fine enough to model the propagation. I knew that I had nothing else to send. I don't know who I'm sending it to, I said, but I'll keep sending it. Go back inside and stay with Derek. Stiles looked at me for one more second, then she nodded and went. I pulled myself to the hull plate. I looked at it for a moment, the rust orange of the clay dust already settling on its surface, the clean line of the intact seam at the top, the long dark crack running below. I raised my right hand. I bent my fingers at the second knuckle so that the flat of the knuckle line was the striking surface, the way Gretchen Holt had shown me 3 decades ago, and I knocked. Twice short, once long. Dit-dit-da. The metal rang clearly. The vibration ran up from my knuckles through the bones of my wrist and into my forearm, and I felt it disperse there the way a wave disperses when it reaches open water. Below me, through the crawler's landing strut contact points, the signal was going into the clay. Where it went from there, and what it found, and whether it found anything at all, I did not know. I knocked again. Dit-dit-da. It is a pattern I did not invent. It appears in 3 separate pre-space maritime distress codes as a short-form distress signal, predating the full standard sequence, used in the era of mechanical telegraphy when the full code was sometimes too slow for the situation at hand. 2 short, 1 long. Not arbitrary, chosen in the original protocols because it was fast to send and distinctive in rhythm, easily separated from the noise of a working vessel. It had been formally retired from the standard survey protocol when the beacon system was standardized, on the grounds that an active beacon was always more reliable than percussion, which was true in all the circumstances the standardization committee had envisioned. I had learned it from my first crew supervisor, a woman named Gretchen Holt, who had come up through the early survey missions before the protocol manual was a digital file. She had pressed it into me early in my second season, on a slow afternoon when we were doing hull plate inspection on a ship in dry dock at Meridian Station. She had not explained the context at the time. She had simply stopped what she was doing, held my hand correctly around the striking position, and made me tap the pattern on the dry dock hull plate until I had it clean and automatic. 2 short, 1 long. She said, "Beacon fails, knock on something." And then she went back to her inspection as though she had not said anything particularly significant. I had thought it was the habit of an old woman who did not fully trust the technology. In the years since, I had come to understand that it was the habit of a woman who had trusted the technology completely and had been given specific reasons. On a specific day she never described to me in detail. To maintain a backup that required no power and no circuit board and no coupling that could fuse into a lump of slag. I knocked for 20 minutes before the Growth appeared. 20 minutes of dit-dit-da on a titanium composite hull plate under a white sky on a shelf that breathed. My knuckles went from sensitive to numb to a kind of steady background ache that I catalogued and set aside. The clay dust continued settling on the plate's surface, and on the backs of my hands, and on the shoulders of my survey jacket. I knocked in a regular rhythm, send, pause, send, the pause long enough to listen for any response, though what response I might hear with my ears through open air on an empty shelf I could not have said. I knocked because stopping felt like closing a door, and I was not willing to close doors yet. The growth came out of the northwest, downwind. I clocked 9 in the group as they cleared the flat zone of broken plates and moved into the open area around the crawler. They were moving in a formation I did not have a precise vocabulary for, but which the survey briefings had described as encirclement approach pattern 2. Not the direct charge, not the fan ambush. The patient close, the one where the pack establishes a perimeter and then reduces it by degrees, tightening the circle until the prey's options are gone. The briefings were clinical about it. They noted that this approach was typical when the pack had assessed the prey as slower or less dangerous than a direct charge would warrant. Not contempt, exactly, but a professional decision about efficiency. I kept knocking. I did not stop. I did not change the rhythm. 9 growth. I know because I counted them twice, with the deliberateness of someone who has learned that facts are the thing you hold on to when your instincts are trying to run. They ranged in size from roughly 2 meters at the shoulder to one larger individual that moved at the interior of the formation. The survey files were clear about this. In growth pack hierarchy, the largest and most senior individual did not lead from the front. It moved in the position where a herd animal would have protected its young, at the center, insulated from first contact. This was not cowardice. It was organizational intelligence. The most valuable cognitive resource in the pack, the one with the most accumulated memory, the most refined behavioral library, the most sophisticated situational model, was the one you kept farthest from the point of first contact until you had enough information to commit it. I watched the large one, amber bar pupil eyes, 2.5 meters at the shoulder rough estimate, smooth gray-brown integument over a structure that was all latent speed. The secondary forelimb joint that allowed the 4-point sprint position was visible even in the standing posture, a slight bend in the forelimb just below the shoulder that in a human would have indicated a weight-bearing stance, but which in a growth meant the sprint position was one motion, one rotation of that joint away. It moved the way things move when they are never in a hurry, because they have never needed to be. They completed their encirclement at about 30 meters radius. No rush, no vocalization that I could hear. The large one moved to the inner edge of the formation on my side, the side facing the crawler, and stopped there at perhaps 12 meters distance, closer than the rest. Not close enough to be commitment, close enough to assess. I kept my hand on the plate, and I kept knocking. The large one looked at my hand, then at my face, then back at my hand. There was a quality in that attention I am going to try to describe accurately, which means I am going to avoid the shortcuts. I am not going to say it was curious or intelligent in the way those words get used casually. What I will say is that it was specific. It was not the generalized attention of an animal assessing a threat or a prey item. It was the specific attention of something looking at a behavior it was in the process of categorizing. Something that had a category system, sophisticated enough to have an in-progress state for behaviors it had not yet placed. I knocked twice, once. The large one's pupils contracted slightly in the noon light. Its secondary forelimb joint made a small mechanical movement, flex and release, the neutral arousal indicator from the survey files. Not attack preparation, not retreat, just attention, sustained, directed. I knocked, the plate rang, the vibration traveled. The shelf was quiet around us, the rest of the pack still at their 30-meter perimeter, the white sky flat and hot, and without opinion. I could hear Derek's breathing from inside the cargo hold, or I thought I could, though at that distance it was probably my mind supplying the sound because I knew it was there. I was aware during those minutes of the precise quality of my own attention, Engineers develop a relationship with waiting that is different from what most people mean by the word. Waiting, for most people, means the absence of action, the gap between doing one thing and doing the next. For an engineer in the field, waiting is active. You are running assessments the whole time. The structural state of whatever you are leaning against, the weather, the thermal conditions, the behavioral state of anything that might alter the situation, the distance to your tools, the tools you have, and in what order you would reach for them if the situation changed in specific ways. I was watching the pack's perimeter positions and the shift, if any, in the large one's posture. I was tracking the sky, the white sky heat that had been steady all morning, the quality of the light, whether there was any wind picking up that might carry my scent more clearly to the downwind members of the encirclement. I was tracking the sound from the cargo hold. I was tracking the condition of the hull plate under my knuckles, the slight warming of the metal surface under the noon sky. And I was knocking steady, rhythmic, 2 short, 1 long. The other 8 grouse had not moved. They held their perimeter positions with the patience of animals that had nothing else to do and nowhere else to be, which was also, I recognized, what I had. We were all doing the same thing in different registers, waiting, attending, holding position while something resolved. I found, somewhere in the middle of that observation, that I did not exactly resent their presence. I did not like their presence. But there was something almost comprehensible about standing inside an encirclement of patient predators on a world neither of us had built, under a sky neither of us had named, both of us waiting for something to happen. The survey files had warned me about the grouse as a threat. They had not told me that the grouse could make a situation feel, in some fundamental way, shared. I kept that observation at arm's length. Feeling a situation is shared with the predators that are encircling you is not a productive operational stance. It is also, in my experience, not something you can entirely prevent, and fighting it costs energy you may need later. I knocked, and then the large grouse made a sound. I want to be careful here. I want to be precise, because this is the part that the debrief board accepted and filed without fully processing, and which Rowan Stiles, who heard me describe it, looked at me for a long moment and then did not comment on, and which I have thought about in the years since with more sustained attention than I have given to almost anything else in my professional life. The sound was low, very low, below the comfortable range of human hearing, felt in the chest and the sternum more than processed by the ear. The survey files had documented grouse infrasound communication. It was in the behavioral section, alongside the formation patterns, but had categorized it as internal pack communication, contact maintenance, position indication during encirclement. What they had not documented, because presumably no one had been in this particular situation to document it, was whether grouse infrasound repertoire included anything that might be considered responsive to external stimuli of non-grouse origin. The large one made 2 short beats felt as much as heard, a pause, then 1 long. 2 short, 1 long. My hand stopped against the hull plate. I stood with my knuckles pressed to the metal, and I looked at this animal that had just in its own register, in its own frequency, in the specific medium of its own body, answered my signal with my signal. 2 short, 1 long. The same rhythm at a different scale in a different substrate. Whether it was mimicry, whether it was coincidence, whether it was something for which I do not have a category and which I am honest enough to admit falls outside my competence to assess, I do not know. What I know is what happened. I exhaled. I put my knuckles back against the plate. I knocked twice, once. The large grouse answered, 2 short, 1 long. We continued that for a period of time I could not have told you accurately was 3 minutes or 10. I was not tracking time. I was tracking the exchange, the pattern, the question and the answer, and the way the large one's attention remained on my hand on the hull plate throughout, not on my face, not on the crawler, on the hand and on the plate, and on the sound the combination of those things was making. Rowan Stiles came back outside. She took in the encirclement at 30 meters, the large one at 12, and me knocking on the hull plate in a rhythm that it was answering, and she did not say anything for a long moment. She looked at the large Grouth the way a xenobiologist looks at something she is rapidly updating her model of. Then she said, quietly, "Derek's breathing pattern changed. Not better." "I know. Sierra, nothing in this survey zone can receive a contact percussion signal at meaningful range. That's not pessimism, that's the survey infrastructure map. There is no seismic monitoring net under this shelf. There is nothing we are calling that has the capability to answer." I did not stop knocking. "I know all of that." "So?" "I'm not sending it to the infrastructure," I said. "Go back inside." She looked at the large Grouth again. She looked at my hand. Something in her expression moved, not understanding, not yet, but the precursor to understanding, the thing that happens before you have the category for what you are looking at. She went back inside. I knocked twice, once. The large Grouth answered. And then the shelf moved. Not the slow plate shift of the geological process I had been walking across all morning. Not the settling of compressed clay under a load. This was something with direction and mass and intention in it, traveling from the south-southeast at a speed that bore no relationship to any seismic event I had trained to recognize. A lateral shear, propagating upward through the substrate, arriving at the surface as a wave of displacement that I felt first in the soles of my boots, and then in my ankles, and then in the bones of my shins. A vibration that was below any frequency I would have called a sound, but which was unmistakably a signal. The Grouth broke formation before I felt it clearly with my feet. The large one moved first, not the sprint, not the attack acceleration. A deliberate lateral move, one step, then two, opening distance between itself and the crawler, between itself and a zone of ground to the south-southeast of us. The rest of the pack followed in a pattern that was not flight. There was no panic in it, no scatter, no individual animal speed. They moved in the organized recession of something that knows exactly what it is moving away from and how much room that thing requires. A river parting around a stone. They had done this before. Whatever was coming, the Grouth knew it, knew its behavior, knew its displacement profile, knew the margin of safety, and were observing it with the professional precision of animals that had been calibrating their behavior against this entity for enough generations that the calibration was instinctive. I kept my palm flat against the whole plate. I did not knock. I just felt what was coming through the metal. What was coming was enormous. I want to be specific about the order in which I registered this. First, my inner ear, a pressure change that felt like mild altitude gain and then kept going. Second, my sternum, a deepening resonance in the bone itself. Third, the metal of the hull plate under my palm, which had begun to produce a sustained hum, not from my percussion, nothing like the sharp ring of a struck surface, but a continuous standing vibration, like a tuning fork held at the frequency where the metal was most willing to speak. The clay to the south-southeast of us fractured on a line approximately 60 meters out, and the surface rose. I have tried to describe the VOR to several different audiences. I tried it first to the rescue team that arrived 90 minutes after the event, on the floor of the rescue crawler, with clay in my hair and on my face and on the backs of my hands. I tried it to the debrief board at the base station, with the lights on and a recording system running and people in clean clothes who were paid to understand what I had experienced and categorize it correctly. I tried it to Rowan Stiles, who had been inside the cargo hold and had felt the displacement without seeing the emergence, and who as a xenobiologist deserved the most careful account I could give. Each time I have tried, I have fallen short of the thing itself, and I think I understand now why that is. I will try once more here, with the advantage of years of thinking about it. The scale was wrong. That is the most accurate starting point. Not wrong as in impossible. I had seen large things on survey worlds, things the briefings prepared you for in terms of mass and dimension. This was wrong in a different sense. When you encounter something very large, your visual system normally gives you reference points. It puts the large thing against a background, and the background tells you how large the large thing is. The vore emerging from the shelf had no usable background because the shelf itself was the background, and the shelf was the vore. The cracked orange clay plates that I had been walking across all morning, that the crawlers moved across and the survey teams mapped and the Growth packs patrolled, they were not geology. They were integument. The breathing floor breathed because it breathed. The conversation that stopped when you walked in was not a metaphor. When the surface folded back from the emergence point, it folded in clean, articulated sections, each plate hinging along its natural crack lines, because those crack lines were not random fracture patterns in drying clay. They were joints. What I was looking at, when the upper surface broke and rose, was the dorsal structure of something that had been resting, patient and inert, and invisible from above and from below. For a length of time I cannot estimate because the survey files had not told me how long it was possible for something like this to rest. The upper surface that emerged above the new ground level was approximately, and I am giving you a field estimate from a shaken engineer under stress, not a calibrated measurement, the size of a 4-story building, footprint and height both. Its color was the rust orange of the clay it had emerged from, which was not a coincidence. Its surface texture was the clay, at a depth, and with a continuity that told me this was not camouflage applied to the surface, but the actual material of the integument, oxidized, dry, carrying 400 million years of geological patience in every square centimeter. It did not look at me. I do not know if it has eyes. I have read everything the survey teams subsequently published about it, which is not very much because what the survey teams subsequently published was heavily conditioned by the need to say only what they could confirm, and what they could confirm from a safe observational distance was limited. What I know from standing 60 meters from it is that it turned. Something in it oriented, not toward me, toward the hull plate. Toward the frequency the hull plate had been carrying through the clay for the preceding 40-plus minutes. The hum in the metal under my palm shifted, not louder, not different in any way I could quantify, just resolved. The way a note resolves when the chord it belongs to is finally played, a rightness in the frequency that was not there a moment before. Dit-dit-da. I had knocked, something had been listening. The Growth were gone from my line of sight. The pack had receded to a distance beyond what I could see clearly on the flat shelf. The large one, the amber eyes, the infrasound answer, the 2 short and 1 long that it had given back to me in the register of its own body. I looked for it at the edge of my visual range and could not find it, and I have thought about that many times. What the Growth knew about the vore, and how they had come to know it, and what the exchange between us had meant in any framework that made sense of all 3 things at once, I do not have an answer. I do not always require answers. I have found, over 31 years in the field, that there are things you encounter which exceed your category system, and the right response is not to force them into a category, but to carry them as they are, whole and unlabeled, in the same pocket where you keep the things you know are important but cannot yet explain. What happened in the next 6 minutes was fast and specific, and I am going to describe it without pulling away from the details, because the details are the thing that matters. The vore moved south-southwest. The direction of its movement opened space between its leading edge and the crawler, which meant that the immediate threat, the threat of being directly in the path of its displacement, was passing. This was the good part of what happened next. The crawler was not entirely clear of its influence zone. When the vore's leading subsurface edge passed beneath the southern quadrant of the crawler's ground contact position, the clay plates in that quadrant folded upward as the vore's mass displaced the substrate. The crawler's port landing struts were positioned in that quadrant. The fold was not violent. The VOR was not moving fast, not at the surface expression level. But it was irresistible in the specific engineering sense of that word. I was looking at a force that no landing strut rated for a survey crawler was designed to resist, applied at the base of the port struts, applied slowly enough that the struts bent rather than sheared, bent, and then released when the fold passed. And the release dropped the port side of the crawler down 2 meters into the cavity that the VOR's leading edge had opened in the substrate behind it. 2 meters. It does not sound like much. In a structure that was already stressed from the blowout damage, 2 meters of drop at one end of the frame produces a torque load across the main longitudinal spar. The longitudinal spar deformed. The deformation expressed itself at the weakest point, which was the cargo hold frame, the hatch frame, specifically, where the frame geometry had already been slightly compromised by the initial blowout vibration. The cargo hold hatch jammed, solid, in the closed position. Derek and Stiles were inside. I was outside. I want to be accurate about the time sequence. From the moment the drop happened to the moment I reached the hatch was approximately 12 seconds, because I was already moving before the drop completed, having read the fold direction and its probable consequence about a second before the consequence arrived. The hatch was jammed when I reached it. I put my hand on the release bar and pulled and got nothing. I tried the emergency release, which is a secondary mechanism on a separate mount, and got nothing there either because the secondary mount was in the deformed section of the hatch frame. The hatch frame had moved 2 centimeters out of true, and the hatch leaf was no longer in alignment with the frame and could not pass through it. I had the compression wrench in my kit. I had 4 sizes. I found the largest, which had a jaw opening that I thought could engage the hatch frame at its least deformed point, and I began levering. There is a section of my debrief report where I describe this as taking 4 minutes and 12 seconds. I am noting that here because 4 minutes and 12 seconds is an accurately long time to spend levering a jammed hatch on a half-submerged survey crawler, while the ground around you is still settling from the passage of something enormous, and your pilot is on the other side of the hatch in a medical condition that does not benefit from 4 minutes and 12 seconds of delay. I am noting it because I want you to understand the shape of those 4 minutes, which was this. They were not heroic. They were mechanical. The wrench engaged the frame at a specific point. I applied force in the correct direction. The frame moved by fractions. I repositioned. I applied force again. I was not performing courage. I was solving a geometry problem with a compression wrench and the specific knowledge of how hatch frames fail, which was knowledge I had because I had seen 3 hatch frames fail before in my career and had memorized the failure modes the same way I had memorized the distress pattern, because Gretchen Holt had told me it was worth memorizing. I was doing the thing engineers do when the tools are limited and the situation is bad. I was using what I had precisely, without waste. Stiles came through the hatch when I got it open. She had a cut above her left eye from the drop impact, a clean diagonal cut that was bleeding with the steady commitment of head wounds, which bleed more than they warrant and which I have learned over the years not to treat as an indicator of severity. She came through the hatch and immediately turned back toward it. "Derek," she said. "How far inside?" I was already at the hatch opening. "Aft bulkhead. He couldn't be moved safely. I had him secured against the aft wall." She paused. "The cavity is still closing." It was. I could feel it in the ground through my boot soles, the slow grinding of clay plates resettling, the substrate rebalancing itself after the disruption of the VOR's passage, the shelf resuming its steady tectonic patience. The crawler's rear section, including the aft cargo hold, was in the closing zone. How long before the cavity closed enough to compress the aft hull, I did not know. I had no reference point for the rate of VOR substrate recovery. I knew it was happening. I could feel it. I went in. The cargo hold was dark and tilted, and had the particular smell of a space that has been pressurized by a blowout, and then compromised by structural deformation, metal stress and methane trace, and something else, warmer, biological, which was Derek. He was at the aft bulkhead where Stiles had secured him with cargo net straps, which was the correct call for a patient who could not be moved under normal conditions and whom she had needed to protect from the drop impact. The cargo net had done its job. He was alive, he was not conscious. I unstrapped him from the bulkhead. I pulled the cargo net into a configuration that could serve as a drag harness, loops under the armpits, the main run of webbing coming forward over the left shoulder toward the hatch. I began pulling him across the tilted deck. A survey crawler's cargo hold is approximately 6 meters from the aft bulkhead to the hatch. On a level surface, with a cooperative patient, 6 meters takes about 40 seconds. On a surface tilted portlow by approximately 15 degrees, with an unconscious patient of Derek's mass, with the deck surface covered in equipment that had shifted in the drop in which I was navigating around and in some cases over, with the structural sounds of the surrounding cavity increasing in frequency and pitch as the clay continued to resettle. 6 meters took longer. I pulled. I repositioned. I pulled again. I got Derek's upper body across the hatch threshold and out into open air before the cavity reached the rear landing struts. Stiles was at the hatch and grabbed him, and we both pulled together, and we got him clear to the waist. The cavity reached the rear landing struts. I will not describe what happened after that in fine detail. What I will say is that Stiles and I were outside the crawler and Derek was partially out, and that we did not have enough. That is the honest accounting. We did not have the time or the leverage or the specific combination of those two things that would have made the outcome different. And I have gone through that accounting many times, and I arrive at the same place every time. We did not have enough. It is not a comfort. It is not meant to be. It is simply what is true. Derek Osei died on the Veth Basin Shelf 37 minutes before the rescue crawler from the secondary cache arrived. He had been dying since the blowout. The Vors passage did not cause his death, in the specific causal sense. The blowout was the cause. But the Vors passage occupied the 6 minutes that would have been his margin, if there had been any margin left to use. I have thought about the arithmetic of that for a long time, and I have come to the conclusion that the arithmetic does not yield anything useful, and that continuing to run it is a choice I am making to punish myself for something that could not have gone differently, and that I would rather stop making that choice. I have not entirely stopped, but I am working on it. Rowan Stiles and I were alive. We sat on the reformed orange surface of the shelf, not far from each other, not speaking. The head cut above her left eye had slowed to seeping. My right hand rested in my lap, palm up. The shelf around us was completely still. The white sky continued to pour light down without comment. There was nothing to see from ground level, no mark, no evidence of anything that had happened here. The shelf had closed, and the shelf was the shelf, indifferent and patient and precisely as it had always appeared. I thought about Derek, about the fact that the rescue team was coming and would arrive and would find us here, and that we would give an account of what happened, and that the account would be accurate, and that accurate would not mean complete, because the complete account was too large for incident report language. I thought about what I would say and what I would leave in the category of things that were true but not transmittable. Stiles said eventually, "What made it come?" She was not looking at me. She was looking at the ground in front of her, the same undisturbed rust-orange clay. I looked at it too. "The signal," I said. She was quiet for a moment. The contact percussion traveled far enough to reach it. Apparently, the survey files say nothing in this zone has the seismic sensitivity to. The survey files did not know what was in this zone, I said. Neither did I knocked anyway. She absorbed this. Then, what did the Grouth know about it? I had been thinking about that since the large one had answered me, and then moved aside in the organized recession of something observing a known boundary. More than the survey files, I said. She said nothing more. The rescue team arrived 47 minutes after that, and we stood up to meet them, and began the long process of explaining what we could and carrying the rest. Approximately 12 meters from the unmarked ground where the crawler had been. The survey crawler, the hull plate, the cargo hold, Derek's body, the shelf had closed over all of it with the patient completeness of something that has been doing this for 400 million years. There was no mark, no disturbance, no evidence. The team lead, a young engineer named Forsyth who was seeing the shelf for the first time, looked at the ground and then at us and then back at the ground and said, "There should be a crawler here." "There was," Stiles said. He looked at us, at the undisturbed clay, at us again. He said, "The seismic record shows a mass displacement event that our analysts cannot account for, and a growth pack of 9 individuals that approached and then withdrew, which has also not been explained by anything in the survey files." He paused. "How did you survive the pack contact?" I thought about the large one, the amber eyes, the neutral arousal flex and release of the secondary forelimb joint. The infrasound answer in 2 short beats and 1 long, delivered in a frequency I felt in my chest rather than heard with my ears, by a body that had been walking this shelf long enough to know what came when the frequency changed in the substrate below. "Something changed the situation," I said. Forsyth waited for more. I did not provide more. After a moment he stopped waiting and began directing his team in the survey of the site, the way young engineers learn to do when they understand that the information they need is not going to come from asking the same question again, but from looking carefully at the available physical evidence. I sat on the clay and I looked at my right hand, palm up, in my lap. The knuckles were bruised from 40+ minutes of percussion on titanium composite. The skin over the second and third knuckle was abraded from the hatch lever work. There was clay in the creases of my palm and under my fingernails and dried blood on 2 fingers from where the compression wrench had slipped once and caught the skin. 2 short, 1 long. On the rescue crawler back to the base station, I sat in the equipment bay, and I did not try to explain what had happened to anyone. I let Forsyth's team manage the communication with the base station, and I let the medic who came with the rescue team look at Stiles's head cut and my hands, and decide none of it required anything more than cleaning and bandaging. And I looked at the equipment bay ceiling, bare titanium composite, gray. The paint worn off in the areas where equipment had been loaded and shifted over many rotations. And I thought about Gretchen Holt. She had died on a shelf world in the inner survey belt when I was 34. A methane blowout, same as Dirac, different world, different seam, same physics. I had not been there. The news had taken 2 weeks to reach me through a backed-up comm relay, and when it finally did I had been in the equipment bay of whatever ship I was on at the time, and I had gone to the nearest hull plate and knocked, twice, short, and once long, and held my palm against the metal afterward, feeling the ring decay slowly into silence. I had done it because I had nothing else to do that felt like the right size for what I was trying to mark. The knock was the right size. It was small enough to do and large enough to mean something, and it cost nothing and required nothing and had no ceremony attached to it that could get it wrong. I had not expected anything to answer. The debrief at the base station took 4 hours. I gave accurate accounts of the blowout, the hull damage, the communications failure, the growth pack contact, the mass displacement event, and the crawler loss. I used the language of technical incident reporting, which is a language I know well and which is designed to carry facts without carrying interpretation, because interpretation before the full data intends to corrupt the record. I described the growth pack's withdrawal without attributing a cause. I described the VOR's surface emergence and its physical characteristics to the best of my ability, knowing that I was giving an account that would be difficult to verify, and that would sit in the files next to the anomalous mass displacement readings from the geological supplemental section, and eventually prompt someone, probably a geophysicist, to begin asking the questions that needed to be asked about what the Veth Basin Shelf actually was. The debrief board accepted my account, gave me a trauma review referral and a 12-week leave, and filed the incident as a Class IV hull loss with one fatality. I did not tell them about the Grauth's infrasound answer, the two short beats and the one long, in the frequency of the animal's own body, answering my percussion through the hull plate. I did not tell them because I could not frame it in incident report language without making it sound like either a physiological coincidence or a psychological artifact, and I was not certain it was either, and I was not willing to let the record reduce it to either of those categories. Some things you carry whole, without a label. This was one of them. 11 months later, I went back to calloused IV. The Southern Hemisphere rotation was voluntary that season. I had enough seniority to decline it and no professional obligation to request it. And I requested it anyway. And I did not explain why to the rotation coordinator, who accepted the request without requiring an explanation, because engineers with 31 years of field experience generally get the assignments they ask for. The shelf was the same. Rust orange, cracked plates, white sky, the mineral metallic taste of the air. The breathing quality which I now understood differently than I had before, though not more completely. I walked to the grid coordinates of the crawler's last position, which I had memorized from the incident report, and I stood there for a while in the late morning light, which on calloused IV in the dry season comes through the cloud cover as a diffused warm gold rather than the hard white of noon. The surface was undisturbed, healed. No mark, no ridge, no change in the plate pattern to indicate anything had ever been there. I crouched down. I put my right hand on the surface of the clay. Not the hull plate, there was no hull plate. Just the clay, which was warm and dry and granular under my palm, slightly giving under finger pressure, carrying the thermal mass of a white sky morning. I knocked twice short, once long. The sound was different through clay than through titanium composite. Duller, the ring absorbed quickly by the porous material, dissipating into the substrate almost immediately. I had not expected to hear anything. I was not, in any operational sense, transmitting a signal. I was doing what you do when you come back to the place where something happened and you want to be present there, in your body, with the specific physical fact of what the place is. The knock was the marker. The thing I had that was the right size. Far to the northwest, at the limit of clear visibility, perhaps 2 kilometers, too far for reliable identification, too far to be certain, something moved below the surface of the shelf. A traveling bow wave in the clay plates, a slow displacement, unhurried, without particular orientation, moving the way something moves when it is not going toward or away from anything, but simply continuing what it has been doing since before the entities currently observing it had arrived on this world. I watched it until it passed beyond the range where I could distinguish it from the general settling of the shelf. Then I stood up, brushed the clay from my knees and from the palm of my right hand, and I walked back to camp. I want to end with this. I have been asked in the years since by survey board members, by the geophysicists who eventually came to study the Veth Basin Shelf with instruments and patience, by Rowan Stiles, who transferred to the Northern Hemisphere but who wrote to me occasionally in the way that people write who have been through something together that they cannot fully explain to anyone who wasn't there, whether I believe the Vor understood the signal, whether it heard dit-dit-da as a distress call in any meaningful sense, whether it came because I called, or whether it would have come anyway, and I happened to be there when it did, whether the Grauth's infrasound answer was communication or coincidence, whether any of it meant what I have spent 11 years and more considering the possibility that it might mean. I do not answer those questions directly, not because I don't have a position, but because I have found that some questions are better carried than answered. Answering them collapses them into something smaller than what they actually are, turns them into a fact that can be filed and moved past, when the right relationship with them is to keep them open, to let them inform how you move through the world without requiring them to become a definitive statement. What I will tell you is simpler. I am a field engineer. I have been one for more than 3 decades. The job requires, above all other things, that you send what you have. When the beacon is gone, you use the comms. When the comms are gone, you use the contact percussion. When the contact percussion reaches no one in the survey infrastructure, you tap on the hull plate anyway, because the hull plate is what you have and because stopping is the only thing that guarantees nothing happens. You send what you have. Into the silence, into the white sky, into the clay that is older than your species' first tool and larger than your categories. You send it because the signal costs you nothing but your knuckles and a moment of your time, and the alternative is closing a door that you cannot know, in advance, is genuinely locked. Too short, one long. Gretchen Holt taught me that in dry dock on Meridian Station when I was 22 years old, with her hand around my hand, making me get the rhythm clean and automatic before she let go. She did not explain why. She did not frame it as a survival skill or a lesson or a gift. She went back to her own work when I had the pattern right, and she trusted that I would carry it and recognize when the time to use it came. She was right. She has been dead for 19 years and she was right. I knocked and something answered. That is everything I know about distress signals. That is the whole of it.